Andrew Williamson here. Welcome back to Williamson Education. In our recent lessons, we've been examining some issues that can arise in sentences. In my mind, I've been imagining this unit under the title, What Could Go Wrong? What could go wrong with a particular sentence? And there are any number of problems that can cause sentences to fall flat. In the last two lessons, we've looked at some pretty black and white errors, meaning that these errors are clear and unambiguous. You cannot write a run-on sentence and say that you're writing a grammatical sentence. You cannot write a sentence fragment and believe that it qualifies as a full independent clause. There are other things that can go wrong in sentences, though, that are a bit less clear-cut. One of those things is the topic of today's lesson, redundancy. Now, if that seems to you like a funny-sounding, somewhat perplexing word, you're not alone. Redundancy is a pretty unique word, and the idea it describes is just as special. What is redundancy? Broadly speaking, a redundant sentence is one in which the same idea is repeated one or more times. Some redundancies are quite obvious, while other ones are rather sneaky and can easily escape detection. Redundancies are considered flaws in writing because they clutter sentences with unnecessary or superfluous ideas. Redundancies add extra words to sentences, and they cloud the concepts introduced in these sentences by having multiple instances of the same idea. Don't write redundant sentences. As we will see in this lesson and in our next lesson on wordiness, writers and readers of the English language prize efficiency. This means that we value clear, concise, straightforward communications that use relatively few words to describe a single idea. As a general matter, if you have the choice between expressing an idea in 10 words and expressing that very same idea in 5, you should express it in 5. I'm not saying that you need to become the next Ernest Hemingway, the 20th century novelist who was famous for his lean, laconic prose style. But I am saying that you should consider which and how many words you use when you write your next sentences. Before we go too much further, let's consider a couple examples of redundancy so that you can see what I mean. Some redundancies are very easy to spot. For instance, you might hear someone say that they ascended up or descended down the staircase. These are pretty straightforward cases. To ascend already means to go up, so you don't need the word up after ascend. Likewise, to descend already means to go down, so you don't need the word down. Ascend up and descend down are two classic cases of redundancy. Even seemingly ordinary phrases will be considered as redundant by some editors. Consider phrases like end result, collaborate together, and at the present time. All of these rather innocuous phrases contain redundancies that will be edited out of your writing by an exacting hand. I have another example here, a case that I see over and over again. This next case of redundancy is a bit harder to pick up, and as a result, many people speak or write as I am about to. Let's have a go at this next practice problem. Here it is. The reason I arrived late was because I got caught in a traffic jam. Sounds not too bad, right? This will seem like a perfectly fine sentence to many people, and that's okay, for the moment. If this seems like an acceptable independent clause to you, take a second to consider where the redundancy might be. I assure you that there is one in the sentence. Do you see how I organize the sentence around the common structure, the reason is because? Well, I hate to break it to you, but that structure is redundant. Why? Because the noun reason communicates the same idea as the subordinating conjunction because. Both words indicate a particular rationale for arriving home late. My preferred version of this sentence uses the correct structure. The reason is that. The reason I arrived home late was that I got caught in a traffic jam. You might also opt for an even simpler structure, this one using the conjunction because. I arrived late because I got caught in a traffic jam. Both of these alternatives are acceptable because each of them eliminates one or the other of the two words that form a redundancy in the initial sentence. Now, in grammar, redundancy sounds like such a bad thing. That idea is redundant, or that sentence has multiple redundancies. But I want to be clear, redundancy is not a bad thing in all circumstances. For example, airplane manufacturers deliberately build double or even triple redundancy into their critical systems. This means that for the major systems like the flight controls that move pieces of the wing, there are often 3 systems that will operate the same piece of machinery. Why? Because what if the first system breaks down? What if the second system breaks down? Pilots require multiple redundancies to keep passengers safe, even though those second and third systems will sit there idle and absolutely unnecessary the vast majority of the time. In planes, lives depend on the proper functioning of the aircraft. In writing, thankfully, it is not often the case that our words hold the power of life and death. So it is less important, even undesirable, that we build redundancies into our systems. The stakes of the words we write are usually lower than the stakes of the decisions that pilots make on an everyday basis. And as we have seen in earlier lessons, there is significant variability across languages as regards what counts as a redundancy. What counts as a redundancy in English might prove wholly necessary in a foreign language. I work with many students who come to English from Mandarin Chinese, and I have noticed a common grammatical structure from Mandarin that often seeps into their English. In Mandarin Chinese, it is often the case that subordinating and coordinating conjunctions need to be used together. We would often consider these combinations redundant in English. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I will translate a basic Mandarin sentence into English for you to consider. Here it is. Although the woman was eager to watch the tennis match, but she didn't have the time. See that? I use the subordinating conjunction although at the beginning of the sentence in order to make the first clause a dependent clause. Then I use the coordinating conjunction but at the beginning of the second clause. In Mandarin Chinese, both of these conjunctions are considered necessary to indicate the meaning of the sentence. In English, using both conjunctions would be considered highly redundant. You would need to choose one or the other to make the sentence read correctly in English. Either, although the woman was eager to watch the tennis match, she didn't have the time. Or, the woman was eager to watch the tennis match, but she didn't have the time. Either of these options would be appropriate in English. In the category of differences between English and Mandarin Chinese, we also find an important difference in how these two languages view intensifiers like very. Speakers of Mandarin Chinese use the word very constantly in order to intensify their adjectives. In some cases, the word very is even necessary to the grammar of the sentence. The situation could hardly be more different in English. In English, the word very is oftentimes seen as superfluous by prose writers and editors. In most instances, adjectives are seen as already conveying the proper degree of intensity and do not require further intensification. The examples that I have given here today represent just a sample of the redundancies you may come across in writing and speaking. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's lesson, redundancy is not so much a black and white error in writing as it is a flaw in style that is to be avoided. Many writers find that a less is more style suits them well in English. Repeated thoughts, superfluous words, and unnecessary intensifiers, all of these redundant elements and more, can be cut out of your writing. In my own writing life, I have found that the quest for simplicity leads to greater power in prose. In college, professors gave assignments with word limits, and although I don't have professors anymore, I still set constraints on how many words I can write on a given piece. When I exceed the word limit, I am forced to go back through the writing and eliminate superfluous phrases. This is a healthy process that causes writing to gain in force. We tend to assume that those who speak the loudest, who write the most boastful prose, are the most powerful. But in my experience, the opposite is true. I mentioned the famous American novelist Ernest Hemingway a bit earlier in our lesson, and his spirit is very much with us as we engage in these reflections on how to avoid unnecessary words. Hemingway was a master of avoiding the unnecessary. The man has so many inspirational quotes, but one of my favorites has to do with the metaphor of the inkwell. Hemingway says, and I quote, "I learned never to empty the well of my writing, but always to stop when there was still something there in the deep part of the well, and let it refill at night from the springs that fed it." Hemingway is talking about a lot of different things with his inkwell metaphor, but one of the things he is talking about is how to use language. Don't overwrite. Hemingway is saying, don't say more words than you need to say. With that, we come to the end of our lesson on redundancy. We'll pick back up next time with the closely related topic of wordiness. That's all for now. Spread the word.